do to you. For this is the law and the prophets. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road is easy that leads to destruction, and there are many people who take it. For the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it. Beware of false prophets who come in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns, or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree bears good fruit, but bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will know them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of the Father in heaven.
God's word for God's people.
May our hearts hear and our lives respond.
Boy, that lives responding part can be the tricky one. We thank God for opportunities to move and to respond in God's name. Feels like a really lucky break that we had so many joys to lift up this morning of ways that we could reach out and make a difference. But do we do it always? Is that part of our nature as God's people? Our scripture this morning, which doesn't appear in the lectionary, reminds us that we're not called to an intellectual exercise when we become disciples of Christ. We're not called to make sure we have down pat the exact right doctrine. And if you're in my box, you are in, because I have the right thoughts. I have the right words. This scripture is all about inviting us to know how dangerous it is to, I can't even say dangerous this morning, but it's a tricky one. That idea that, boy, do I know the right things. Boy, do I have the right thoughts. Do unto others, we are told by Jesus. Do unto others as we would have others do unto us. And all along the prophets, everything you will read in Scripture, Jesus is saying it's hanging on us. Because that when Jesus said that the greatest commandment was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself, that's it. Do unto others as we would have others do unto us, because we are all God's children. Not just those ones who wisely root for the Patriots, but all of God's children. Those ones who pick the wrong team are ones we are intended to love and reach out to, no matter what. And there's things that are a lot deeper, obviously, on this special day as we honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We are well aware of the fact that there are things that are much, much deeper than, as you might say, skin deep. We look at the top picture here on the left, and that's the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia. And he's left the dais where he was presiding over the state senate. That was just January 18th, and he sat down. He left the dais and sat down because Senator was, and he knew the speech was coming, saying that they thought they should adjourn the Senate early that day in honor of Robert E. Lee's birthday. And he was respectful, but he said, you know, this is the same year that is the 400th anniversary of the first Africans being brought into Virginia as slaves. And if Robert E. Lee, and he may have had good points, but if he had had his way, if things had gone as he worked to achieve, what does that say if your skin is that wrong color? That color that God created and loves beyond measure? What does that say if you are descended of people who were enslaved? And some of us are easily old enough to remember watching on television civil rights protests, peaceful protests. I remember my parents just being appalled, my mother crying, my father angry to see on television, and they weren't angry that it was on television, they were angry that it was happening, that a young man of color was being beaten, not for doing any aggressive thing, but because he had the audacity to put his body in between his mother's body and the angry people who were trying to attack. Little girls in their lacy, remember we used to wear those lacy ankle socks, and I always thought they were so cool. Little girls with their lacy socks in civil rights parades also being hit with water cannons, and people saying, well, how dare those people bring their children? Don't they know it's unsafe? And how dare anyone say that to people who brought their little girls to church in Atlanta and had them killed in that church by a bomb? How dare anybody say that to people like Martin Luther King Jr., who had his house with his family inside attacked by a bomb? So was it not safe to have those children there? No, it wasn't safe. But God's truth was, it wasn't safe anywhere. And if we think that's all fixed, all we have to do is listen to friends and family members of color, and we will learn that it is not fixed. How much of a right have our NFL players had to protest respectfully on a knee, as was recommended by a Marine who had, no, a Navy SEAL, sorry, who recommended that as a respectful protest, because at a funeral, when they hand over the flag, that's part of what they do. They get down on a knee as a sign of respect, but also flagging that things are not right for people of color. And we have to know that. We have to know that if we dare to listen. And we have to listen. On the right-hand side, some of us have seen this. There's a video. It's gone viral. It's been on the news. On the far right is Nathan Phillips, who is an elder of the Omaha Nation, and he is a leader in the indigenous peoples movement as they work for more rights. Every year, as a Vietnam vet, he goes to Arlington and has a peaceful ceremony for those vets in Arlington. Well, he was there at the same time as, from Kentucky, a private prep school bussed in young men in their Make America Great Again hats who were protesting women's rights, who were protesting abortion rights. And when these young men had done that protest, here were the indigenous people walking along, and Nathan Phillips is hitting his drum and doing a chant for peace. And as he does that, these angry young men who are done trying to work against women's rights and now are accosting, and what they're yelling to him is, build the wall, build the wall. And he thinks to himself, this elderly man, well, this is not a good situation. And so he tries to move away, to leave. And they circled around and blocked him so he couldn't leave. And so what he did bravely was stand his ground, continue his chant. But he said it was clearly their goal to threaten him. And what does it mean as we read our scriptures, do unto others as you would have others do unto you? We joke about football affiliations, and that is a joke. But there are other ways we have affiliations and habits that sometimes close us off to what other people are trying to say to us. And we don't get to choose how people feel about how they're treated. And we don't get to not listen to those stories. The Me Too movement really opened some doors where people were able to say, this happened to me, and no one would hear. We hear in the news again and again rape charges that are simply dropped and people going free, and how that feels to those victims who worked so hard to try and testify. It's not okay as a person who's always been safe and privileged to say, oh no, I don't want to hear your story. We have to dare to hear stories. Oh, I bet you have some good ones, Journey. We have to dare to hear one another's stories. The scripture goes on to tell us that there's this wide door that's real easy to get through and travel along. That path of least resistance, when we're so used to our cultural privilege, we're so used to our own expectations, and we're good people. We don't mean to hurt anybody. We want to be kind. We want to be good listeners, and yet we're so sure sometimes that everything's fine when everything is very not fine.
She woke up.
See, sometimes things are not fine, even if the rest of you are doing okay. But God invites us to go through that more narrow gate. And it talks about the road being hard, but really, from the Greek, the word is like you're pressed in. And we know that there are situations that press very hard upon us. I look around this room and we've all had those kind of times, one way or another, in our lives where we were hard pressed. And yet, we're called to push through those hard pressed times to get to where God's leading. It is not enough, our scripture reading concludes, to say, Lord, Lord, if we don't do what God calls us to do. And the biggest part is to be able to be good listeners to people who are different than we are. Gentle listeners and people who are willing to hear, respond, and change in a way that makes a difference for all God's people. If we were in a country where we couldn't eat and there were drug wars and our children were being threatened and we wanted to escape and flee and came to a place that would be safe, where the law says that if you've been in danger, you can come in anyway and seek asylum, in a country where that's the law, what do you think Jesus would want? The same Jesus who says, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Some of us are very, very safe. Many of us on this planet, many neighbors of ours are not safe. How can we listen? How can we move? How can we do what Jesus calls us to do to make